Goedenamiddag, goedenavond, dames en heren, en welkom op de Varouzhan-lezing. Ladies and gentlemen, very warmly welcome you to this year's Varouzhan lecture. Apologies for the slight delay, which has to do with the live stream and the recording for the people who aren't here. As you may know, as you can hear in the name, the lecture is named after Taniel Varouzhan, the Armenian poet who studied in Ghent from 1905 until 1909. Actually, in the building, just the one you see over there, that's one of the buildings he would have frequented. It was already there. So in the years he spent in Ghent, this was a period that he came into deeper contact with Western European literature, which then shaped his poetry afterwards. And this lecture was set up since 2019 as a collaboration with the Center of Western Armenian Studies in the person of Grigor Moscovian. Both to commemorate Varouzhan, but also to give a platform for the history and culture of Armenia. In the past years, we have had lectures on the Armenian diaspora. We had lectures on the cultural environment of Constantinople at the time when Varouzhan was living there. For this year's edition, given the fact that we're 110 years after the genocide, we thought it might be a good occasion to bring that topic to the fore. Now, before I introduce this year's speaker, I want to signal a few people who wanted to be present here but have to apologize. This includes the ambassador from Armenia, but there is a very nice diplomatic representation here. This includes our vice chancellor and the dean of our faculty. Before I introduce the speaker, Grigor will say a few words of welcome, then we'll have the lecture, and after the lecture there will be occasion to ask questions. So, Grigor, please.
Բարև սիրելիներ, ընտանիքը այս տվյալ հավաքվեցավ։ Taniel Varouzhan տարեկան դասախոսությունը արևմտահայկիդական ուսման կենտրոնի եւ վստահ եմ, որ նաեւ Գենտի համալսարանի մշակութային ուրացույցին վրա յուրահատուկ տեղ կգրավի։ Մայիսյան ամենամյա այս հանդիպումը երկու հաստատություններու միջև համագործակցության քեղեցիկ օրինակ մլալ է ավելին է։ Մեր հարկանքի դուրքի մատուցումն է մեծ բանաստեղծին։ Գենտը Varouzhani հոգին եւ իմացականության թարգմանոցն է եղած։ Նաեւ իր ցանկի դարապախտ մեկ հանգրվանը։ Այս ընտանեկան հավաքը կարելի եղավ շնորհիվ խումբ նվիրյալներու Մովսեսին, Աթամին, Անելգային եւ Լորիին, իմասնավորի Ghent համալսարանին, պրոֆեսոր Պիտեր Վան Նուֆելենին եւ դոկտոր Ջորջիա Նիկոսիային։ Բոլորին բարձ կգադար։ Ամենամեծ շնորհակալությունս պրոֆեսոր Ուղուր Ումիտ Üngörին։ Այս տարի օգոստոս 26-ին մեծ բանաստեղծին Թաժան սպանության 110-ամյակը պիտի լրանա։ Իր հիշադակը դեվականացնող ամենամյա այս 5-րդ ցերնարգը նվիրված է իր եւ իրեն ճակատագրագից 1.5 միլիոնի խոխողումին։ Մարդկային հասկացողության սահմաններու մեջ ամբարփակելի այս ոճիրը արդի բացության այս հավաքական վայրակության անասելի սարսափաբադումը պետք է մարդկային ցեղի խիղճի ամրագուր փորձակարը դառնար որուն դիմաց քննության պետք է տրվեր մարդկային ընկերապարոյական չափանիշերը։ Բայց դժբախտաբար 110-ամյա հերավորութենե հետադարձ կարճ հայացքը բավարար է հաստատելու վայրակություններու եւ ցեղասպանություններու անվերջանալի շարանը։ Ողջագիզում, Կամբոդիա, Ռուանդա եւ այլ հավաքական վայրակությունները միջին արևելքի եւ այլ վայրերու մեջ։ Վերջին 110 տարիները մարդկային մթակնած հիշողության պատմությունն է։ Գիտավորյալ հուշատապումի ամոթալի խարանը մարդկության ճակատը զարդարող միակ բսակն է։ 110 տարիներու մարդկային փրածոյացած եւ իմաստազուրկ արժեքներու թեմ ցեղասպանության զոհ ուրիշ փանաստեղծիմը ով մարդկային արդարություն թող ես տքեմ քուջագադիտի ջիչին արցականքը գմնագախված սուրիական անաբատներու անտաշիրիմներուն վրա Վարուժանյան սլացքը թեպի լույսի աղբյուրը հանաբազորյա թրությամբ գտևատվի Գեղձիկը դարձած է նորորյա դասնապանյան Այս մեկը նորություն չէ մարդկային բազմահազարամյա նենք էյութենեն բխող երևույթ մնե 110 տարիներ շարունակ նույն տասը կգրտնենք բայց համարորեն ոչինչ կսորվենք ոչինչ մարդկային փանագանությունը անգասելի դեղատվության մեջ է մագընթացությունը ձանձաղամտությանն է իսկ մարդահրավերը այս վիճակը հասկացողներուն եւ երբեմն գտնել փորձողներուն շնորհակալություն
Thank you, Igor. And then it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Uğur Ümit Üngör, who is a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Amsterdam and at the Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And in the first phase, if I can say so, of his academic career, he worked on the creation of modern Turkey, and in the framework of that on the Armenian genocide with 2 books, so The Making of Modern Turkey, Nation and State in Eastern Anatolia, and Confiscation and Destruction, the Young Turks' Seizure of Armenian Property. And from that starting point, he has branched out to work on genocide studies in general, including a volume on genocide. And then most recently, he has been working on paramilitarism, including a book in 2019, Paramilitarism, Mass Violence in the Shadow of the State. And from that, he has mostly recently been working on mass violence and the prisons in the Syria of Assad. So I think he is eminently qualified to give tonight's talk, which will put the Armenian genocide also in the context of broader genocide studies. So Uğur, we're very happy that you're here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter and Krikor, for inviting me, for your generous hospitality. It's a pleasure and an honor to be giving the Varouzhan Lecture here this year. I'm also very happy to have so many people present. Thank you for coming. I think it's important that we, in general, continue our commitment actually to learn about genocide. No matter how difficult of a topic it is, no matter how painful of a topic it is for a number of us, also personally, not just professionally. So I'm always, I have a bittersweet feeling always when I see large audiences when it comes to events or lectures, public events, or, for example, when I teach about genocide, because unfortunately the topic remains relevant. I would like to today, I'm going to do 3 things. One, to speak a little bit about the the relevance of elites, of intellectual, political, economic, religious elites in genocide. So why is it that elites are often the first ones to be assaulted? And what does that mean for our understanding of genocide? Second, we will look at the form, actually, and the shape, the course of the Armenian genocide and the role that the destruction of elites played in the genocide. Famously, of course, in 24 April, the commemoration, of course, of the genocide, 24 April, because it's the day that elites were of course, arrested, attacked, and massacred. And third, I think genocide is always best understood by looking at the local level, by looking at how did this play out in the cities, in the streets, in the provinces, within families, indeed also even at the individual level. So I will also take you on a journey, if you wish, to the province of Diyarbakir, which I've studied the most intensively, which I've followed for a long time, from the genocide onwards all the way up to now. So these are the three elements of my talk today. I'm also really happy that there is a kind of escape door here in case you don't like my lecture, then I can run off here, just then nobody can follow me. And I'll start first with, of course, what is genocide? Now, this research field has developed since the 1970s. It came, of course, out of Holocaust studies, increasing conceptualization. What is genocide? How can we best understand it? Different disciplines have looked at the topic. It's not the monopoly of one discipline, of historians only. On the contrary, by now even, for example, neurologists even look at the topic of genocide. For example, the impact that epigenetic trauma has on families over various generations. What does perpetration do to people? And how are men, mostly there are men of course committing genocide, how does it affect themselves when they commit mass violence on this scale? So it's an eminently multidisciplinary field, and every year there are hundreds of titles are being published. Now, my definition of genocide is that it is a genocide is organized mass violence against a group of people that exists in the minds of the perpetrators. So this doesn't have to be an actual real group, but it's mostly an imagined group. So the perpetrators often are after the destruction of this imagined community. And I take this concept, of course, from Benedict Anderson, imagined communities that make real victims. Now, genocide also not necessarily only against ethnic groups or religious groups or national groups. The global history of genocide, especially in the last, let's say, 150 years, has shown that any and all kinds of groups can be victimized by a state as long as there are these abstract categories in the minds of the perpetrator. To give you an example, one of the most genocidal regimes in the 20th century, of course, one of the most prominent authoritarian regimes was under Stalinism. In a really exceptionally good book, Norman Neymark, American historian, wrote a book called Stalin's Genocides, plural. He argues that the mass violence that Stalin committed against a number of categories could be as real, let's say, as ethnic groups such as Crimean Tatars or Chechens, but could also be as abstract as, for example, the category of, let's say, enemies of the people, vrat naroda in Russian. What is an enemy of the people? It could be extremely abstract, but it didn't mean these people were not arrested and treated with massively deadly violence, including mass executions. Now, this is kind of how I see genocide. I also see fundamentally genocide not only as a form of deadly violence. There can be genocides without any bloodshed, cultural genocides. Look at the Native Americans, look at Aboriginals, look at the Uyghurs, for example, in China right now. And look indeed also at the Armenian genocide. There are examples of cultural genocide elements there. So most often it is a holistic policy of destruction of a group. And this is what we're going to be looking at. Within these examples of genocide, elites, they carry a particular relevance. And I think it's safe to argue that in almost every single example of genocidal destruction, political elites, or religious elites, economic elites, intellectual, cultural elites, you name it, are assaulted with either with particular brutality or very early on in the process. And the Armenian genocide is no exception to that. On the contrary, I argue that the Armenian genocide is actually one of the most, let's say, exemplary genocides, a genocide that you can learn a lot from by comparing its elements to other cases. Now, let's first talk about this elite, the assaults on elites. Now, we're all aware, of course, in the Second World War, September 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland, and almost simultaneously the Soviet Union invades Poland from the east. Now, of all the policies that the Nazis carried out in occupied Poland, the Aktion AB was the assault against Polish elites, went roughly hand in hand with the assault on Jewish communities, of course, but in principle was a separate policy, in which the Nazis, of course, vision for Poland was that they are kind of inferior Slavic people and they should not have a political or intellectual or economic elite whatsoever. Polish people in the Nazi mind should be educated up to, let's say, lower high school level, max vocational training, and that's about it. There should not be a Polish university, Polish intellectuals, poets, writers, artists, etc. The opera, the Polish Chamber of Commerce, none of this was relevant. All of this could be destroyed in the mind of the Nazis. So what happened almost in the initial weeks of the occupation of Poland was an attack on the Polish intelligentsia. Now here's a picture, for example, of the University of Krakow, the Jagiellonska University, one of the top universities in Europe historically and in the world, where the professors were first collectively fired, and then a significant number of them were arrested, deported to concentration camps, and with varying intensity executed, disappeared, or died under certain circumstances. Now this attack on the Polish elite, and there's some books about it, this is one of the books in Polish, that attack on the Polish elite is something that people have argued that Poland has never really overcome. So the capacity, the intellectual, academic capacity, the political activity that was destroyed in these initial weeks was never really compensated for. So whatever happened for Poland now, it's of course 80 years later, 85 years later, the initial destruction had such a destructive impact on the course of the Polish history that it was particularly impactful. Almost simultaneously, on the other side, the Soviets, under Stalin, of course, also invaded Poland. With the invasion of Poland from the east, the Soviets also assaulted Polish elites in an almost similar policy of disempowering the Polish politicians, refusing to accept, of course, the sovereignty of Poland already was an example of that, arresting professors, sending them to the Gulag, to the farthest ones in Magadan, in eastern Siberia, and, of course, most infamously in the arrest of the, let's say, military elites, all the way from generals up to down to lower commissioned, non-commissioned officers. Over 20,000 of them were arrested and they were executed in the infamous Katyn forest massacre. Now, one would say that normally this is a war crime. You take prisoners of war and you execute them, which is against any and all of the Geneva Conventions. But it was more than that. It was also an attack, because there were also writers there. There were, for example, there were journalists there. There were also specialized doctors, because of the wounds that you incur on the battlefield, of course. All of those people, with almost no exception, were executed and dumped in mass graves. I'm generally kind of hesitant giving advice about watching movies about genocide. But this movie, Katyn, by Andrzej Wajda, which I think of all the movies I've watched on genocide, most often these movies, they have these Hollywood endings. They have happy endings. But of course, genocides don't have happy endings. They often have unhappy endings. But I think movie filmmakers find that depressing to present to an audience. So they generally weave some kind of positive element to it at the end. This movie doesn't do that. So no spoilers, but my advice would be to watch it. And it gives that the assault on the Polish military and intellectual political elites, which of course then Poland never overcome. In other genocides too. Take from the genocide that already was mentioned by Krikor, Cambodia, the integral execution of all Cambodian academics by the Khmer Rouge, the assault on Tutsi intellectuals, politicians, doctors, indeed even clergy. So, in the genocide in Rwanda, 1994, attack including even on like Catholic clergymen that were of Tutsi ethnicity, an attack specifically on the elite. The example of the genocide in Bangladesh, committed by Pakistan in 1970, where one of the first things that Pakistani militias, the Pakistani army and sympathetic Bangladeshi militias did was to arrest the complete academic cadre of the University of Dhaka, which is one of the major universities in Southeast Asia, and to execute every single academic. Everybody with a Ph.D. with a Bangladeshi background was executed within a matter of 2 or 3 days. Particular attack on, of course, leadership of the incipient nation. Now, why does this happen? It is because the perpetrators think that if you assault the elite of a group, then the communities that look at these elites for leadership, for an example of how to behave, or, for example, of how to resist the genocide, then that element is gone. And there's no way of resisting, because it's like decapitating a chicken. It has no idea where to run anymore. So there are no ideas, in fact, there's no organization of how to resist the genocide. So it really facilitates a broader victimization of the community. And that's why I think when there are around the world examples of political, academic, intellectual elites being assaulted by states, I think that's very often a bad sign. So it's more than just something that deals with these elites. It is a harbinger, very often a preface of more violence to come. Now, these mechanisms, we've of course seen them in the Armenian genocide. We're all familiar, of course, with the course of the genocide, but what I would like to do is to give a kind of explanatory framework of why the genocide, in particular, in the genocide, the Young Turks went after the Armenian elites first. Because in essence, that was the easiest thing to do, because they were sitting in Istanbul, often in the same neighborhoods, in the same streets. And the more difficult things to do was actually to evacuate all those villages in Muş, Van, Bitlis, Diyarbakir, Trabzon, Erzurum, Sivas, and all of the provinces. And the reason for that, I think, or one of the major reasons, is results from a consequence of the Balkan Wars. Now, in 1912, October 1912, the Ottoman Empire still looks like this green, the green territories on this map. Yeah, this means that all the way up to Bosnia, so in the Sanjak area, was Ottoman Empire, and all the way to Basra in Iraq, all of this was still Ottoman territory. And we know that in the Balkan Wars, a coalition of the Red Balkan states, they agreed to attack the Ottoman Empire, to seize territory, which is what they did in 2 installments of the war, 2 periods of the war. They basically defeated the Ottoman Empire and took all the green territories and divided the spoils among each other, while they also sometimes fought against each other, for example, Greece against Bulgaria. And at a certain moment, the Bulgarian armies had taken so much territory that you could hear the cannons being fired when you were sitting in the Sublime Porte in the Baba Ali, the government seat in Istanbul. So imagine the sense of almost an apocalyptic fear among Ottoman political elites in this period. Now, together with that, once the war is won, or for the Ottomans is lost, what happens is a kind of multi-directional, initiated by different states, but similar policy of expulsion of Ottoman Muslims. And this was a two-pronged process. On the one hand, people fled ahead of armies that were coming because of the reputation of those armies. And at the same time, there was an official policy instated, for example, by Serbia in terms of Serbian paramilitaries. In Bulgaria, it was both civil, political, and military policy to expel, to a large extent, Ottoman Muslim civilians. And in Greece, similar policies were at stake. Now, sometimes I show this photo of this is a long, of course, convoy of Muslims kind of fleeing the Balkans. There were long convoys of people fleeing like this. I show this photo sometimes to my students, and they think it's a picture of the Armenian genocide. And I tell them, it isn't. This is 2 years before that, in the massive assault on Ottoman Muslim civilians. And I think especially one of my explanations in the books I've written is that the brutality and violence of the Armenian genocide can be explained to some extent, if not to a large extent, by the violence and the victimization of these Ottoman Muslims from the Balkans. And we know that not because of just theories that we construct, but because of the fact that these people themselves, they often wrote down their victimization. They've written about what this meant to themselves, to their families, to their communities, and also to the empire indeed. So an entire generation, which I call the Young Turk generation, these were men roughly born around the same period. They were in the prime of their lives when the Balkan Wars happened in the 1910s. So between, one would say, 25 and 40 years old, roughly. They were highly educated, mostly under Sultan Abdul Hamid's new academies and new schools that he established. They were Turkish nationalist, or at least Ottoman nationalist, but with a strong tinge of Turkish ethnic or cultural nationalism. And because the Balkans were really the heart of the Ottoman Empire, right? It wasn't Ankara. So Ankara was a tiny village that nobody could locate on a map in this period. But the heart, the beating, cultural, political, intellectual heart of the Ottoman Empire was, of course, Thessaloniki, and the area around what is now called Macedonia. Macedonia. You can't call it Northern Macedonia, I think, anyway. And this generation, so this phenomenon of these people being victimized in this way, brought a kind of a wave of publications based on strong emotions of fear, revenge, profound revenge, feelings of vengeance, exacting vengeance against Balkan states, because what was worse to the Ottomans, of course, to these elites, than being defeated by their former subjects. This was a profound kind of humiliation. Like, losing a war is one thing, but losing a war against your former subjects, that was something profoundly humiliating. And so there's a kind of generational phenomenon here. Most of these people, they were from middle class, upper middle class families, sometimes from pretty prominent families in Thessaloniki, families that had for generations supplied the Ottoman Empire with the top bureaucrats, top military personnel, writers, people working in the cultural field. And for them now to be dispossessed and uprooted and sent off in these convoys to Istanbul is something that I think was a profound change in the political culture of the Ottoman Empire. And the best example of this, I think, is this man named Mehmet Nazım, Dr. Mehmet Nazım, who was born and raised in Salonika in one of these prominent families. And you might know that in 1912 there's a kind of a demographic majority. Yeah, it depends how, of course, the demographic majority of Ottoman Muslims in this area. He was born and raised in that city. Then, what happened in the war is he became radicalized. The loss of the Balkans, for him, was a profoundly kind of radicalizing experience. Then, when the Greek army took Salonika, they arrested him because they knew he was one of the kind of political elites in the Young Turk Party. They put him in prison, and later he was exchanged on a POW exchange. And he ended up in Izmir, and as soon as he landed, you can see it in his kind of publication record. He started publishing majorly inciting articles, inciting violence against the remaining Ottoman Christians in the empire. In one of the publications, he said that that Ottoman Christians have now shown their real face, the masks have fallen, and that now this is a very clear line between who's with us and who isn't with us. Now, of course, these articles, they really concerned Ottoman Greeks, Ottoman Armenians, who were still living there, of course. Some of them argued that, well, we have nothing to do with what happened in the Balkans. In fact, most people are loyal to the Ottoman Empire, so why this major emotional shift and change? But uninterested in that. He didn't engage with any of these serious conversations. And it's also no surprise that then 2 years later, in his case a year and a half later, he played one of the major organizing role in the Armenian genocide. Right? Then, of course, we know, well, the empire falls, etc. And he ended up in 1923 in the Turkish Republic, thinking that he could still play a role politically. But Mustafa Kemal Atatürk he eliminated rivals, not just him, but a number of other ones, and he was executed in these political show trials. But it shows really well how somebody who, prior to 1912, did not have a major record of collective hatred against Armenians or Greeks, not a profound sense of exclusive Turkish nationalism, still to some extent believed in, let's say, Ottoman coexistence, or that the empire makes sense, don't necessarily have to throw it away and build a Turkish nation state, but the experience of the Balkan Wars changes him, fundamentally. And he's not the only one. The generational phenomenon of many of these people, who then later ended up being perpetrators of the genocide. Now, when we take a look at the landscape of the genocide, we're of course familiar with it. I'm not going to go into the details. But there are a number of things that are important here. One is that elite competition was an issue already before the genocide. So when you read, for example, discussions in Ottoman parliament, or when you read polemics between Armenian, some members of parliament or activists, and Turkish ones, and you see there's a kind of competition going on over the true nature of the eastern provinces, Western Armenia, Eastern Anatolia, Northern Kurdistan, whatever you want to call it, this region basically. And the nature of those conversations were about to whom does this belong, right? And there would be Armenian intellectuals and some nationalist factions, of course, who would argue, well, demographically it's clear that there are certain majorities in certain regions, that the historic heritage, the archaeology is fundamentally Armenian in this region. There's a huge, long presence. And then Turkish nationalists would argue, yeah, but that doesn't entitle you to establish a nation state, otherwise the empire will fall apart. So there are these back and forth conversations already, some of them relatively nasty, before 1915. And it's not surprising, although you have to be careful with, of course, determinism, that some of those conversations that end up particularly politicized, and they end up with Armenian elites exactly on the receiving end of the violence. Now, just to recap kind of my vision of the genocide, the reason why the Armenian genocide is, as I said, an exemplary case of genocide is because it's not just one process. So sometimes I get students who come to me who say, Professor Üngör, I'm interested in the Armenian deportations. Or they say, I'm interested in the Armenian massacres. And then I ask them, that's fine, but what about the genocide? And they ask me, what do you mean? And I said, well, the genocide was more than just deportations or massacres. There are at least 7 different policies that differed, but that geared into each other, and together, only together, produced a process of fundamental destruction, not only of Armenian human beings, but also of Armenian heritage, of Armenian place names, of Armenian memory in this region, and really of an Armenian future, starting from 1915 onwards. And those are, of course, There's the boycott in 1914 already, before the genocide, the economic boycott. There are the expulsions, denaturalizations, before the genocide, before the 24 April. Then there, of course, there's the 24 April, the massacres of elites. Then we have the deportations, the massacres, the forced conversions to Islam, the kidnappings of children. So all of these are not separate policies that you can take out of context and then amplify or something. No, only together they produce a process of destruction. And none of these policies, from 1915 April onwards, were ever in the benefit of Armenians. So there was never a situation, for example, in which, for example, the conversions were, the mass conversions were, for example, rescinded, for example. That only happens after 1918. And, yeah, these are nuances and details. Jamal Pasha ran a different policy. But basically from the top onwards, from the political top, Talat Pasha and Enver Pasha, they ran one policy, and that was fundamental destruction of the group identity. Now, I've written elsewhere about deportations, about the confiscation of property, dispossession, of course, also an aspect, the dimension of the genocide, or of the massacres, of the perpetrators, the Teshkilat-ı Mahsusa. But today, of course, we're speaking about elites, which brings me to the important, but one would also say bizarre moment of 24 April. It's interesting to note that there's still no real good academic study of this particular day. There are memoirs, good ones. There are kind of collections of sources, useful ones, but there's no comprehensive study of it. And I think it deserves a study like that, but it requires a kind of a little bit more investment in archival materials especially, and also memoirs. Now, what is interesting about the 24 April roundup is the extent to which it was a surprise to the victims themselves. Right? So, most often, in almost all cases, genocide is not announced priorhand. So no perpetrator regime will say, next week we're going to arrest all the Jews in the city and we're going to send them to a camp and we're going to gas them. There's no such thing. Most often the plans are made secretly, and the plans only become apparent once they are carried out. But once they're carried out, it's often too late to respond to them adequately. Now, here are two men, for example, who became victims of the arrests of the elites. Krikor Zohrab, intellectual, lawyer, writer, member of parliament, really prominent voice, one would say left liberal, and the Bishop of Malatya, Mikhail Khachadurian. Right? Obviously in the clergy, conservative, religious person, very different individuals. Now, what did these two men have in common with each other? That they were arrested and executed. One would say absolutely nothing. And there are examples of, for example, those who survived and wrote memoirs of their arrests in Istanbul in 24 April 1915, but they're all put in this prison called Ibrahim Pasha Sarayı, which is now the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Civilization. Ironically, it's a vast kind of stone building right across the Sultan Ahmet Mosque. And ironically also right next to the building of the Tapu Kadastro, so the title deeds, where all the title deeds are kept, which we tried to get access to, but it was impossible. And they're put in this prison, and in the courtyard of the prison, there's a tree. And there are people, actually, survivors, who describe that tree, sitting in the shadow of that tree, or people, because it was spring, of course, so the first buds, the first leaves already are starting to bud. And they're looking at each other, they're entering these cells and looking at each other, thinking, why am I here? I have nothing in common with these people. There were people put in these prisons that had profound conflicts with each other, a dislike of each other, completely different political visions, personal rivalries, etc. So they're thinking, why am I here with this person? He's very different from me. But of course, and only there gradually it starts to dawn, once they're being put on the boat, sent across to Haydar Pasha train station, and then deported into the Anatolian interior, that something different is going on here. And of course, one of the individuals also deported, Yervant Odian, which I think is one of the best, certainly one of the funniest writers, Armenian writers ever. We're familiar of Enger Panchuni, for example. His books are really fantastic. Now, this was somebody who in no way was close to Armenian nationalism. All the way up to the outbreak of war and beyond. He wrote about that the empire will overcome this is a temporary war, things will be fine in the end, and yet they ended up arresting him. Right? So, and this is important because the argument that the denialists would use is there was disloyalty. But there's zero disloyalty from a man like this. So what is the point of arresting the editor-in-chief of Zamanak? And he very quickly, actually, as he was being deported, he found out, or he realized what was going on. And there was no word, the word genocide didn't exist, of course. So he coined the word Yegeren, or is it one of the most important uses of the term, at least, in his memoir, Accursed Years. And only through the experience of arrest, and he got away because of a mistake, a bureaucratic mistake. They were going to deport him to Deir ez-Zor, and then last minute they made a mistake and sent him back to Konya. He explains these experiences in this memoir, which I think is one of the most important memoirs of the Armenian genocide. And it's here that the victims start understanding what's happening to them. Because before that, there's only surprise. They're flabbergasted, like a deer in headlights. They don't understand why this is happening. And you can say, well, that's maybe naive. But for let's say, the brutality or the criminality of the genocide is exactly that, is that the victims could not have surmised or even imagined that level of violence and destruction, because it didn't make any logical sense. Arrests of Tashnak political leaders made sense. But this didn't make any sense to a lot of people. No. And there are a number of other really interesting memoirs. I urge you to read them. Some of them are longer, others shorter. But what this meant, basically, was the genocide was a process in which it began with the arrests and the executions of the elites, and then gradually expanded to different categories of Armenians. So it began with the elites, then quickly was expanded to the arrest and destruction in the labor battalions, of course, and then just massacres of men. Once most of the men were dead and gone, there was another expansion of the genocide in May. Of course, the women and children in the deportation orders. Anybody, basically. Women, children, elderly, categorically. And then, so I made that circle thick because there you have basically the apostolic Armenians. And then at some point, varying in 1916, 17, there's yet another expansion of the victim category. Then Catholic Armenians then also are assaulted, to their great surprise. There are memoirs, for example, of Mercimekian, for example, who wrote about the Ankara, Catholic Armenians from Ankara, who was an apolitical community, and yet arrested, deported, destroyed. Then again, another expansion to Protestant Armenians. Then yet again, another expansion to, because genocide gains momentum, to foreign, so non-Ottoman Armenians, which of course made a diplomatic incidence. If you have somebody with an American passport or Russian passport, then you can say, well, we arrested and killed him because he's Armenian. Yes, but he is an American citizen, which means it creates a diplomatic incident with Morgenthau. And then, finally, there's an expansion, yet again, somewhere in 1917. The most interesting recent research into the category of converted Armenians is by Vahid Tashjian, who wrote a book based on memoirs, two important memoirs of men who survived the genocide from Antep into Syria, Hama and Selemiya, where there were conversion strategies going on. A really good book, and he argues there that at some point, even those Armenians who out of fear converted to Islam, out of fear and of course out of coercion, which is illegal in the Sharia and whatnot, Sunni and Shia, you're not supposed to do that. At some point, Talat Pasha says, I don't believe that they really converted. Well, of course not, because for conversion you need a completely different procedure than in a wartime and based on coercion and violence. threat of violence. So he also starts deporting, rearresting Armenians who convert to Islam and deporting them too again to Deir ez-Zor. Right? So in no way you were safe. And I call this the kind of essentialization of Armenianness, or the racialization actually. Once you were Armenian, it didn't matter what you become. Protestant, Catholic, Episcopal, or whatever, Muslim even, you were to be deported and to be destroyed. Now, when we look at this process in the provinces, where the heart of the genocide occurs, because some people have argued 24 April gets a lot of attention, but it's Istanbul-centric, right? So you also have Armenians obviously living in, including elites living in the provinces, where the arrests and the killings did not happen on 24 April, but later. For example, this riveting photo, I think, really, of the Kayseri Armenian elite who were arrested integrally before their mass execution. And it could be hours before their execution or maybe days before their execution. We don't know exactly, but most kind of precise reconstruction of the period in May is convincing that they were arrested, put together, others were rounded up, and then collectively executed. We're not sure exactly where. There must be then a mass grave somewhere in Kayseri, outside the city, where the body must have been dumped. So a good example of a very diverse group of men from different backgrounds. Some of them were businessmen, some of them were benefactors, people from religious backgrounds, people from political, apolitical backgrounds, people working for the Ottoman Bank, for the actual national bank of the country were they supposed to serve for, people from the army, arrested, decommissioned, uniform taken off, and massacred. Another example from Kharpert. So, economic elites. There were, of course, in the provinces, the further east you go, certain, let's say, crafts, artisanal crafts and businesses, there were monopolies that Armenians had. One of the things, of course, is the goshgar, the people who make the shoes, and nalbant, so the cobblers, the people who make the horseshoes. And this family, for example, the brothers Pamukjian in Kharpert, this is a photo of them in Raymond Kevorkian's famous book about the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, 1914, also arrested and massacred outside the city. And so economic elites. And this is where my story becomes a little bit more economic, or at least acquires a dimension of what was the political economy of these destructions of elites. Another example, some people argued before 1915 that it was the best wine in the Ottoman Empire, Sukiasyan, the wine company. It's funny because it says Vin de Kartal. And Kartal is a neighborhood in Istanbul where still people drink a lot of wine, interestingly. Right? So, but dispossessed, deported, never to be heard from again. Right? So, we wrote a book about the confiscation of Armenian property together with Dr. Mehmet Polatel. And we looked actually for a number of the offspring of people who were dispossessed in 1915, and we found it exceptionally difficult to find them, even though we looked everywhere, in the U.S., Canada, Armenia, Lebanon, and some of them really were integrally annihilated. There's not a trace left of some of these elites. And of course, you can say, well, what does winemaking have to do with being elites? But in that particular industry, right, there are skills that nobody else has. There's expertise nobody else has. There are connections to vineyards and peasants in Kharpert, in Mush, that nobody else has. So if you look at all of these kind of business skills and acquired capacity, then nobody else has that. The moment that you kill these people, then the entire industry falls apart. And that's what we've seen also. We see the cotton industry falls apart completely. The vineyard industry falls apart. Ever since that period, actually, there's not a single good wine you can drink from Turkey, according to people who are no wine. And so the destruction of elites has a fundamental political economy character. Which brings me to the final part of my talk, and this is where we get into Diyarbakır. Diyarbakır province was a relatively large province, of course, larger than what the provincial boundaries are now, of course. It also incorporated parts of Mardin, of course, and larger parts of what is now Batman, Sason. Parts of that were all Ottoman province of Diyarbakır. And in Diyarbakır, there was an Armenian community and also an Assyrian community, Suryoyo community, that was the backbone of a number of industries and trades and businesses. For example, the cotton industry. For example, the fabric industry and the silk industry. Pardon, not cotton. Cotton is in Adana. Silk industry was in Diyarbakır, and there were like 3 or 4 major Armenian businesses. They monopolized that actually. So they were so good in that trade, nobody else could actually be successful in it. Now, at some point, Dr. Mehmet Reşit, who was a Circassian medical doctor, young Turk nationalist, was appointed as governor of that province. And this happens in late 1914 or early 1915. Very quickly, and this is a radical CUP member, so Committee of Union and Progress. He's also relatively high up, and also somebody who was radicalized by the loss of the Balkans, if only for the fact, he writes, that it triggered him as a Circassian for having lost the Caucasus. Anyway, he starts ramping up the genocide relatively fast, to the extent that he is actually ahead of orders given by Talat Pasha. So Talat gives certain orders, sends them to all provinces. I mean, I've seen these orders in the Ottoman archives 20 years ago in Istanbul. Talat writes to all provinces, and he lists the provinces. Armenian villagers have to be, the Armenian villages have to be evacuated, people have to be deported to Deir Zor. Please report the process of this, the progress of this policy, etc. Now, as soon as Dr. Rashid gets an inkling of these orders, he starts actually overperforming, to put it in that perspective. So he starts arresting, executing people even before they're supposed to be executed. He expands the genocide to the category also of arresting Assyrians. He goes after the Assyrian community of Mardin, Diyarbakır, and Tur Abdin, Midyat. He sends his militia, Circassian militia over here in this picture, you can see them, sends them to even to the Assyrian villages, to the extent that the massacres that he commits there, so instead of rounding up people, sending them to the deportation, to Deir Zor, there's a lot of massacre at the spot, in villages, outside of villages, which of course disrupts a lot of Muslim villagers as well, right? Because of it creates kind of a frenzy of killing, to the extent that at some point Talat Pasha sends him a telegram that he should stop. And literally he says, the measures that we ordered that to be carried out against Armenians should not be expanded to also include the Assyrians. Right? And that's a telegram he sends in June or in July 1915, which means that's from May to July. Incredible massacres being committed against Armenians and against Assyrians. These are reported back to Talat, and only at some point he says, we told you to destroy the Armenians, not the Assyrians. And this is an important, actually, an important moment, because you can see that there's a norm of violence, and if you go under it, then Talat is angry. He tells you, he spurs you on, actually, to perform more and better. This is what happened to the governor of Konya. But if you go over it, also Talat tells you to tone it down a bit, interestingly. Now, Dr. Rashid, and this is where we get into the elites thing. These Armenian elites that I mentioned, mostly economic elites, they competed in this city with a number of Muslim elite families. Like in every city, also in Salonika, you had, let's say, political, military, to some extent intellectual elite families. 3 of them in Diyarbakır were Pirinççizade, Müftüzade, and Cemil Paşazade. Now, in a way, this is kind of normal. There are cities all around the world right now where families are competing with each other. Here, too, there's a diamond industry, for example. I mean, normal economic competition is not something that's necessarily violent. But the moment that a genocide is ordered from the top and is bolted onto the structure of family competition, that's the moment where some families can think, you know what, our historical rivals, we can get rid of them once and for all by using the genocide in our own benefit. And this is what happens when Dr. Rashid goes to these families and he says, I've received the order from Talat to get rid of the Armenians. Then the Cemil Paşazade family refuses to cooperate. They don't want to be complicit in it for various reasons. They were relatively close to Armenians. They had people also in their tribe who were assisting in various scribes, for example, who were Armenian. They refuse, so they're marginalized. They're not punished necessarily, but marginalized. These two other families, the Muftizade and Pirinçizade, at the behest of their leaders, their kind of prominent patriarchs, Aziz Feyzi and Şeref Ulu, they do cooperate in the genocide, and they're rewarded for it significantly. So, for example, Aziz Feyzi, he was responsible for the confiscation policy. So what they did is, we know Surk Giragos Church, of course. So in the courtyard of that church, it's a really big church, in the courtyard of it, that is actually where the confiscation procedures occurred. That's where they were organized. So let's say somebody would have a family, the family would have all types of properties. Carpets, a piano, obviously money, furniture, real estate and whatnot. Somebody would rob the place, bring it to the church courtyard, and Aziz Feyzi and his men were there to register everything, to make sure that it's redistributed to the right people. Not the wrong people, not Cemil Paşazade, they didn't get anything. They were marginalized to the extent that they were later expelled to Kamishli in Syria. They ended up fizzling out. They have no presence in Diyarbakir anymore. These other two families, on the other hand, profoundly benefited from it. They eliminated these Armenian economic elites from the face of the earth and were rewarded with it. And they ended up being, and this is also interesting, that most of these histories of the genocide, they end in 1915 or 1923. And I always ask myself, why? Because I want to know what happens to these cities. How did the cities change without any Armenian economic activity? And second, what did the perpetrators do? Look, I mean, just to remind you, the man in the middle, Şeref Ulu, a perpetrator of the Armenian genocide, lived until the year 1976. I mean, I'm born in 1980. I could have met him almost. There are other examples of people who lived until the 80s. So how did they fare then? Well, having destroyed and usurped the wealth, the new Kemalist government, which wants to establish the Turkish nation state, continued with the expulsions of Armenians who returned. And that's kind of the saddest thing. In 1918, the empire falls. Armenians in Deir ez-Zor, in Syria and elsewhere, they think, oh, okay, the massacre is over, so we can go back home. And as soon as they go back home, many Armenians actually at that moment experienced violence. Because they came back, and in the same house that was robbed, you knock the door, and some guy opens up, and he says, what are you doing here? He said, well, this is my house. This was the very moment that many Armenians actually were killed. And there are some interesting statistics about them as well, about this, so some people who have studied this episode of violence as well. So most of them gone, ended up in Syria, Halep, Beirut, Burj Hamud, etc., or elsewhere. The people, the perpetrators of the genocide, including the Ulu guy from the middle, the picture in the middle picture, he ends up becoming the head of the Chamber of Commerce of Diyarbakir. And this is a picture I found in 1935, from 1935. He, and of course, most of the men sitting around the table, in one way or the other, were involved in the genocide. And of course they were, because Talat's game spiel is very easy. If you help me, I help you. Right? You contribute to the genocide, then you're rewarded with whatnot. Property, privileges, political positions. The mayor of Diyarbakir was Aziz Feyzi for a long time. Which brings me to round off gradually. There are two different interesting models to explain the Armenian genocide. One is what I call the Armenocentric model, to sort of focus on the collective experience of Armenians. And in this theory, which also to a large extent was, for example, Richard Hovhannisyan, Vahakan Dadrian, so the doyens of the field, they adhere to this theory, which is not wrong, it's just one theory, namely that there's a continuity of violence. Right? So it started with the Tanzimat, it didn't work, and then there were massacres ever since until the genocide, and everything ended up with Hrant Dink. Hrant Dink was predictable because it's a continuation. There was one poster I saw when he was assassinated that said 1.500001. So it's the 1.5 millionth and one victim of the genocide. This is one way of looking at it. It's not wrong. I try to look at it from a different perspective. I try to look at the regime, at the perpetrators, not at the victims. Namely, I argue, or I think, that in 1913 there was a coup d'etat in Istanbul by the Young Turks. They installed a dictatorship, Talat Enver, Dr. Rashid, Dr. Nazım, Dr. Bahattin Shakir, etc. That they, within a year and a half, committed genocide against Armenians and Syriacs. Let's not forget the Assyrian communities. Then their violence continued in Pontus against the Pontic Greeks, again in Koçgiri in Sivas against the Alevi Kurds, in Kilikya again in the 1920s. Vahid Taşçıyan's Ph.D. thesis actually is about the violence from the 20s, in the 1920s. The burning of Smyrna, Izmir. Then the massacres in Diyarbakir after Sheikh Said rebellion. The massacres in the Ararat region after Khoybun rebellion, etc. Pogroms against Jews in Thrace. The Dersim massacre in 1938. And finally this dictatorship, or this generation that I showed the generation of men, that were voted out of office. And if you look at the perpetrators and the organizers of every single one of these episodes of violence, it's the same generation. It's the same Young Turks. Maybe not Talat and Enver, but almost everybody under them, or in mid-level positions, they expanded their power base, they grew in the bureaucracy, and at some point they were running the country. For example, Şükrü Kaya, he was running the deportation system on the ground, became later Minister of Interior for a long time, until 1938, until Atatürk died. Mustafa Abdülhaluk Renda, for example, governor of Bitlis, one of the most brutal perpetrators, organizers of the genocide, later on took really important positions, became even vice premier even under Atatürk. And then things changed after 1950. But the reality is, it kind of spells the end, if you will, of Western Armenia. Because the new Turkish Republic says two things. In a nutshell, we don't want Armenians in this particular region. Right? So you can go to the Republic in the Caucasus, that's fine. Even Istanbul, yeah, you can stay there, that's fine. But this particular zone, there's a racial definition of it, and there's a spatial definition of it. Here, you cannot be. You can go to Beirut, you can go to Halep, that's fine. But not here. Because they, of course, have a guilty conscience based on the genocide that just committed, and then a return of Armenians would have meant also incredible conflict actually with the perpetrators, which is what we see in every genocide. When the victims return, that's when things get really interesting. Now, to bring this to an end, in the 1920s and 30s, there are of course Armenians in the Mandate, in the Syrian Mandate, and also in Lebanon, in Aleppo, for example. The attack against Armenian elites continues anyway in this period. So I've seen, for example, in the Interior Ministry archives in Ankara, intelligence reports that Turkish, then it's border police, gendarme, and also the intelligence, they write reports about Armenian intellectual activity in Aleppo, because they want to know what's going on over there across the border. But they can live there. They don't send like assassination teams. They don't go and invade Aleppo, but they want to know what's happening over there, just in case people get crazy ideas of coming back. Now, those are really interesting pieces. At some point, maybe I'll write a piece about that. And then, of course, just a contemporary, it's an afterthought, an epilogue anyway, but kind of unpleasant. But the attack against Hrant Dink, or the assassination of Hrant Dink, of course, undoubtedly deep state involved. There's no way that kid did it by himself. It rings echoes of the 24 April episode, right? So that kid could have just assassinated a random Armenian from the street. You have to just walk around in Kurtuluş neighborhood in Istanbul, Or you can go to Vakıflı village, pick some random person from the street, but he didn't do that. He picked an elite person. He picked a visible, cultural, intellectual elite person. And that has particular relevance. Because what did that mean? I think it meant, to the extent that these friends, some of them I consider my friends, maybe don't want to think about it right now, Armenian public elite figures in Turkey, right? But it was an unmistakable message to the rest of these people. Do what you want, write your books about Armenian cuisine, you can teach Armenian and Western Armenian to kids, that's totally fine, but don't get it in your mind to start talking about the genocide, start demanding restitution, reparation, justice, etc., all of these things. And I think that probably the most prominent person here is Garo Paylan, of course, which in a way is somebody I consider very brave, but also in a way socially dead, to the extent that if it was up to the same people who assassinated Hrantik, they would have gotten rid of him already. For the reason that he's stepping out of line. Go do your cuisine, you make your music, or do whatever you want, but don't ask for the things that he's asking for. Now, we've discussed a couple of things here. Elites as first targets of genocide. So the moment that elites are arrested, assaulted, killed in various ways, that's when you should ring the alarm bells, because it's a harbinger of more violence. Second, what we've seen in the Turkish Republic is elite replacement. There was an elite in all of these cities, intellectual elite, cultural elite, economic elite, in all of these cities. Trabzon, Muş, Adana, etc., etc., almost invariably were Armenians. They were killed and they were replaced with a Turkish elite that never really made it. So that the Diyarbakır Chamber of Commerce, never half as successful as the Armenian artisans who were working in Diyarbakır before 1950. And it's even in one of the orders of Talat Pasha that I've seen, where he specifically says, we've expropriated all this stuff from Armenians. We are doing this to create a Turkish national bourgeoisie. He says it literally in an official order, top secret, circular to all of the provinces. So the point of the Turkish Republic is actually to create an elite. Because the moment you have that, you displace the others. But it also means, not to end completely on a depressing note, regeneration and resilience. So the people that I've showed you before, the fact that there is somebody like Garo Paylan, for example, or that there are vocal Western Armenian intellectuals, is, I think, also gives a sense of hope as well. And so that's why my final point is maybe to thank actually Krikor for his efforts in keeping Western Armenian language alive, in keeping also memory and heritage alive, and also educating that many students. Because education is the only way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uğur, for a really illuminating lecture about bringing in material from other genocides, but also offering different models, different ways into understanding the genocide. As I announced, we have time for questions, so who wants to kick off? Maybe, please.
Thank you very much. I think something that comes... I wanted to ask, how do you avoid in your writing and in your research the conflation of elites, which you pointed out in your talk definitely exist and they are targets of violence. How do you avoid the conflation of the existence of these elites with the tropes of that you hear them in anti-Semitic tropes, you hear them in anti-Armenian tropes of so-and-so controls this, so-and-so controls the economy, so-and-so controls the industry. Mm-hmm. How do you keep those two separate?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, I think. There are, to just kind of preface that answer, there are widespread prejudices and stereotypes still in Turkey about how shrewd and organized and controlling Armenians were of the economy, right? So these tropes exist. There are also anti-Semitic tropes like that. Like they control the banks and things like nonsense like that. So the same thing here. there are two ways of dealing with it. One is simply empirical, right? So you just point out, look, you say, there's a list that we found, for example, of all of the, these were the hazelnut exporters from the Trabzon province, 1914, right? So Trabzon province, which is now also the Black Sea coast, famous for hazelnuts. According to the statistics, Turkey produces 60% of all hazelnuts in the world. Exports them left and right. Nutella makes chocolate paste out of it, and so it's a global economy. And we found, for example, a list of the 140 top exporters of hazelnuts in Trabzon province, 1914, right before the genocide. And of these 140, approximately 100 of them were Armenians, and then 35 of them were Greeks, and then there were like one or two, maybe somebody with a Russian nationality, and there was maybe one Muslim. That's about it, right? So this is empirical fact. I'm not making it up. This is what it says in the Ottoman documents. So you show it empirically. It is true that, for example, the silk industry were these three families, right? They ran it. And that's kind of, it's interesting being so close to Antwerpen, for example, where, of course, there are, let's say, over-representation. It's a significant representation of a particular group in a particular industry, right? That's kind of normal. Let's say in Amsterdam, 70% of the kind of good basketball players are Surinamese, right? Well, at the same time, the diamond industry, for example, is, let's say, 70% Jains, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. It's just kind of people develop networks, people do normal economic activity. But you show it empirically, while at the same time, you also demonstrate, based on the perpetrator's mindset and from the perpetrator's documentation, of how these facts on the ground were woven together selectively, cherry-picking details, and putting a kind of phantasmagoria together, putting an imagination together, a nightmare together, as in, our economy is controlled by these people. Because that's ultimately the part of the impetus, part of the kind of violent impetus against Armenians is because of the stereotype that they control everything in the Ottoman Empire, right? So, and there's another thing, maybe a third point here, is just because a particular economic activity is dominated by Armenians, doesn't mean Armenians dominate that industry. Because there is no kind of secret room in which people get together, let's control the hazelnut industry. There's no such thing. This is just how it's historically grown, also because of Ottoman policies. If you can't be active in the military and the army, what do you do then? You go into trade, you go into, not to mention that the overwhelming majority of the victims of the Armenian genocide are normal, simple peasants. Totally different ballgame. And so these are the three strategies to deal with it, yeah, of course.
Yes, okay, thanks. So my English is not very good, but I have one question. All the time we speak about Turkey, which is a part of responsibility of other countries in Armenian genocide, namely Russia, Germany, of other countries.
Yeah. Of course, there's again, every single genocide that we know out there, if it's committed by one particular state or regime, has support, diplomatic support, military support, political backing from other states. In Rwanda, that was France. They even had a commission about it. In, for example, in Sudan, under Omar al-Bashir, back in the old days, in genocide in Darfur, he was supported by China. He was on a picture with Hu Jintao, then he's on a picture with Xi Jinping. They fly in, they make a business deal, they back him in the Security Council in the United Nations when they have to vote about genocide in Darfur. Genocide. No, says China. Why not? Right? So that's in a way, it's a common thing. It's really commonly well known, especially that certain superpowers back, like smaller countries. In this particular case also, of course. I mean, there are, all of the German documentation is free, is out there. You can watch it on armenocide.de in German originals and in English translations. And you see there very clearly, there are early warnings. German officials are saying, we had conversations with Ottoman officers, they're saying they're going to kill all the Armenians as soon as the war begins. So there's early warning, one. Two, there's eyewitness reports, right? The consul of Aleppo, for example, various military officials, and civilian businessmen as well. Some people are Germans who are married to Armenians. They write report after report to the consulate in Istanbul, in Constantinople. Nothing. And third, after there are massacres committed, there are mass graves. And Walter Rössler, for example, one of the famous consuls, he goes to Deir ez-Zor. He goes down the Euphrates River. He says the river is clogged with dead bodies. He writes a thick report, sends it to Istanbul. And what does the ambassador say? Literally. He says, well, our alliance with Turkey, with the Ottoman Empire, they say Türkei in German, of course, is too valuable to sacrifice it to these alleged human rights abuses against Armenians. Right? So basically, you have the human rights abuses against Armenians, and you have the alliance with Turkey. And this is more important. And they say it with that many words. That makes you, it makes you, in German they say Mitschuld, so you're complicit actually in the genocide. Because had the ambassador said to Talat, you're going to stop this genocide now, otherwise we stop any and all military cooperation, no more cannons for you, no more oil for you, no nothing for you, then he would have stopped it, 100%, because they were too dependent on foreign powers. They could never have completed the genocide without this backing, which means Germany, of course, has to be complicit in it. When it comes to the Allied states, Donald Bloxham has written a book about how they have promised things to Armenians, and they never follow up on their promises. They promise beforehand to offer support, to offer backing, cover, protection. They don't do any of that. And then afterwards, once the genocide has occurred already, there are vague ideas of establishing a protectorate or an independent Armenia, but with whom? With which people? If 1.5 million people are dead and in the desert, right? So it's a cynical ploy also by these Allied forces to, when the French also, for example, when they occupied Kilikia, they don't do anything for the Armenians. Not really. I've read like 2 or 3 books about it. All I see is an expansion of the French Empire. I don't see real commitments of reversing the consequences of the genocide, taking Armenian pain seriously. I don't see that. But we shouldn't be surprised about it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture and presentation. I think I have 2 questions, but for that I have to ask you to go 2 slides back if possible. One more. No, I suppose it's much back. Here.
This one.
The regime-centric one.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, this was interesting in the sense that you have suggested that this starts with 1913, basically, and this is the same group of radicalized people, and some of them are not top-level officials, but they continue their existence within the bureaucracy, and they're sort of the people that have the same mindset and have seen basically the process that they were never really affected. They are continuing to work in the bureaucracy. So my question is, where does this really end? And is it a similar process with other cases of genocide? Because I suppose the blame falls mainly on the top leadership, the decision makers, but the people that were the mid-level management, they sort of continue to exist in that country. So does this mean that they go on with their radicalized approaches and continue violence and xenophobic policies towards those certain groups even after it's criminalized, or there's a stop? Have you seen this in any other case, or is this the main characteristic of these kind of regimes?
Yeah. No, this is a very good example of a very good question. Thank you. So what? There are examples of genocides in which the genocidal regime falls. Right. After 1945, there's no more Nazi Germany. They get rid of the flags. They vet the bureaucracy to a large extent. There's a different head of state. There's a different constitution, etc. But there are also examples of genocides where the perpetrating regime remains in power, like Stalin, for example. In 1938, he kills 800,000 people. Then he deports this ethnic group and that ethnic group. He massacres, he destroys the entire Eastern European German population, etc. We know the crimes. And then it's 1945. And then he sits next to Churchill and Roosevelt as the victor of the Second World War. And then there's, in Amsterdam, just to give us a local example from my city, there are 3 major lanes in southern Amsterdam. South Amsterdam has 3 like wide lanes with trees. One is called Churchill Lane, the other one is called Roosevelt Lane. The third one is now called Freedom Lane. But that's because until 1962 it was called Stalin Lane. Right? So, and these are 2 different things. In Cambodia and Rwanda, for example, the regime falls. This is a case in which the regime falters between 1918 and 1923. There's hope, and Armenians come back. Yeah, there are local conflicts, but they come back in principle. And the new Sultan in 1918 urges Armenians to come back and orders the government, send me a list, because he sits basically in Talat Pasha's documents. The new interior minister goes through the documents and says, what has this idiot done? So we need to reverse these policies. These people they're subjects of the crown, so of the Sultan. So they try to reverse it. But then again, Kemal Atatürk comes, and of course, so it's a faltering of the regime. The top might have been gone, but what they call sub-top, right under the governors, the ministers, the deportation bosses, the military officials, almost all of these people under the surface continue their work. And there are 2 important things. One is their mindset is the same. It's a Turkish nationalist mindset. Right? So the examples I gave are really clear, and what those people have spoken about in, let's say, the 1920s when they talk about Armenian presence, or when there's the, for example, the massacre in Dersim, 1938, which is organized by the Kemalists, also significantly by Interior Minister Şükrü Kaya. Şükrü Kaya is somebody who ran the deportation machine in 1915. So he's Talat Pasha's assistant. So Talat tells him, go to Adana and see for yourself, write a report about whether the orders are really carried out. He goes there, he carries it out, gives other orders, and comes back, writes up the report to Talat. So he's a bureaucrat of the genocide. This man in 1938 worked closely with the top Kemalist authorities, Atatürk himself, in subduing, destroying this region. What happens is that, and this is what Dersim Kurds, they say that themselves, when you interview them in the oral history reports, when the Turkish gendarmerie entered Dersim and entered these villages and started burning and destroying, they went after the Armenians first. They went after Dersim Armenians specifically first and foremost, before going after the tribes who went into rebellion or whatever. Now why is that? Nobody is going to tell me, I don't find it very convincing at all, if they say, someone like Şükrü Kaya has nothing to do with it. I think he has everything to do with it. And should there ever be more transparency in Turkish archives, you would see that. Easily. That's my hypothesis.
Here? Yeah. This slide is really interesting. The years you are mentioning here, they are coinciding with the time that a kind of new identity is being formed for Turkey. And whatever was done by Kemal Atatürk during these years, creating a new identity for Turkey, the Turkishness, now we see that there is a kind of return back to pre-Kemalist thinking,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And the identity which was created by him or by the regime, as you are mentioning here, now is in crisis. And do you think that there is any possibility to return back to pre-regime times for recreating the identity, Turkish identity, which had existed before that?
Well, that's a very good and very sophisticated question. You've clearly thought about this a long time, which is good. With the rise of the AK Party, with the AKP, there were very clear kind of societal movements and also policy in the government to distance themselves from this period, from this violent period. Because for whatever the Ottoman Empire was, if you look at this region, this state, this area, and this country, in the past 150 years, this was the most violent period, right? Not the Ottoman period, even not the Abdul Hamid massacres, right? So it's a violent period enough as it is, but it's not the complete and utter destruction of the entire Armenian population in this region. Or of the, for example, expulsion of Jews, for example. Right? So that only happened in this period. So, and the problem is that what the Kemalists did, first they commit all this violence, in a nutshell. First they commit all this violence, then they write in the history books and they teach the Turkish children that none of this happened, or it happened for a good reason, they deny it. So they imbue and they instill in the historical memory of entire generations of Turkish people a particular version of this history. Now you pick off just any random person in the street in Turkey, you ask him, what are the important moments in this period? They will say, well, in 1914 they attacked the Ottoman Empire, then it was Gallipoli, Çanakkale, Kemal Atatürk was heroic, then in 1919 he decided by himself, not true, to go to Samsun and to liberate the country. In 1923 he was heroic in setting up a nation state that he already had the idea of. The Sultan betrayed us, ran off to Italy. That's not true, he was expelled. So all of this version, in the minds of millions of people, there was an effort from the AK Party, especially the liberal wing of the AK Party in that period, to unlearn this, to unteach this version of history. And we know this because of Turkish universities. So I've been going to Turkish university since 2005, all the way up to now, basically 20 years. And in the beginning, you saw really good changes, also in like certain NGOs. To give an example, Ahmet Davutoğlu is an academic. He was a founding member of the AKP, and he had an NGO called BİSAF, Bilim ve Sanat Vakfı, so Science and Art Foundation. There's a major building in the middle of Süleymaniye neighborhood in Istanbul. That was a place where you could discuss anything. People said you could go there, talk about the genocide, talk about the confiscation, talk about Kurdish rights, talk about the deep state, talk about torture in the 1990s. Anything was possible to discuss, because they were prepping to get rid of this heritage. This is also a burden, actually, for Turkey. Well, if you don't deal properly with these people in this period and with the offspring of people who are victimized, of course you're going to get, yes, you're going to get Armenian pressure on Turkey to recognize the genocide and get compensation. Of course you're going to get PKK. A lot of the top leaders of the PKK are people who had parents or grandparents massacred in one of these periods. I'm not very surprised that they set up an organization to fight the Turkish state. Right? That's not rocket science. But the effort to unteach all this version of history failed. Failed because of a number of reasons. One of the major reasons, I'm happy to talk about it here, but next week, Wednesday, I'm going to Turkey, so maybe when the cameras are off later. But you get my drift. So. No. But it's still, this is a shadow that hangs over the country. If no government deals with this properly, there's no way that these conflicts are going away.
There is a theory that Young Turks rule continued till mid-1950s. Do you agree with this? Because many Young Turks remained as bureaucrats, high officials, members of parliament, and so on.
Yeah, the Young Turks, in a way, are a little bit like an oil stain, you know? You get an oil stain in the sea, there's an oil tanker bursts, the oil spreads everywhere. They have environmental people who come to clean it up, but there's always a certain level of pollution that remains in the water. There's a joke that they make about the Young Turks in this way. So even Democrat Party, Democratic Party that in 1945, then 1950 really voted or took the Republican Party out of power. There were even people, Young Turks, former Young Turks, they would say, who were members in the Democratic Party. Now, yes, but they were not the worst perpetrators. It's also not the case that the entire CUP or all of the Young Turk Party were all fundamental criminals. There's also wings or aspects or groups with that movement, within the party, that had nothing to do with the genocide. Some of them even resisted the genocide. But the main perpetrators, they were in power until 1950. Then, of course, you get the 1955 pogrom. And if you look there, then you see like vestiges of kind of, CUP, Young Turk thinking. And of course, also, they're in power for quite a while, which means they've also anchored themselves in society. They've also educated a new generation of bureaucrats. in a particular light, in a particular ideology. So, but in a way, the let's say the ghost of the Young Turks is never gone. It's still with us. If it wasn't with us, they would have disassembled Enver Pasha's grave, for example, Talat Pasha's grave in Istanbul. It's still there. It's on a nice, respectable park right across the main courthouse of Istanbul, and it just sits there, as if there's something to be proud of, right? So the ghost of it is always there, and I think the failure of the government, the AKP government, was to not properly deal with this period.
It's kind of continuation, continuing of his question. When dictatorship is voted out, but things continued also later on, I am not sure which year, but it must have been somewhere in 70s, I think, pogroms against the Greeks in Istanbul.
I think
When
55.
It was 55?
Yeah.
Yeah.
September 55.
When they also wrote on the walls on the windows of Armenian shop owners, "You are the next."
Yeah.
So which year was it, and who were it if dictatorship is voted out?
And also about some massacres against Alawites,
Mhm.
Zaza people, and so on.
Mhm. Yeah, so the two different things here. One is the pogrom of 6-7 September 1955, which was an attack against, really against the neighborhood of Beyoğlu, which is formerly Pera, where the presence, visibility, and economic activity, cultural activity of Turkish Greeks and Turkish Armenians was very much visible still. Now, there are studies of that, pretty good studies also of that particular pogrom, which is related, they would argue, less with, let's say, a continuity of this particular period, because there was no point actually of cleansing Istanbul of all these people, because you can actually leave a couple of visible minorities in the vitrine in Istanbul, so you can see, look, we have a multicultural society, how wonderful. Yeah, but what about the 100, 200 villages in Musa and Bitlis? So there's an argument that it's because of the conflict in Cyprus. The conflict in Cyprus begins then, of course, to kind of be escalated, and that actually there's a Cyprus solidarity movement of Turkish national students. So they're educated by the Young Turks, children of the Young Turks, if you will, who then commit that pogrom. But the interesting thing is the pogrom, as terrible as it is, exactly that. It's a pogrom. So a little bit like Kristallnacht, the number of dead is very low, relatively speaking, to all of these other examples, right? And for example, they could have massacred many more people, and they didn't, interestingly, which means that there was a certain level of restraint, and that restraint is uncharacteristic for the Young Turks, right? So I think that's a different thing. And then, of course, you have the violence in the 1970s. That is related to urbanization from, so there are Alevi villages in cities like Maraş, Çorum, Erzincan, Sivas, the kind of Alevi areas where people from the villages go to the cities. They set up shops, they start competing, they start becoming visible with a visibly different identity. And it's there that political groups try to take advantage of these differences and these changes. But it's a different type of thing.
But still, it was tolerated by the government. It could have been prevented, don't you think so?
Yeah, of course. And one of the theories of, let's say, Turkish Republic history is the notion of deep state. Right? Deep state means, which later was taken by Trump in a completely different way. He totally misunderstood the concept. The deep state notion is that the Young Turks, in this period, consolidated their power, especially in the army, but also in the intelligence, to the extent that they could allow any elected government to, take the elections and then make policies, change certain things, but not the fundamental things, right? And that the deep state continued all the way up to the 2000s, and that the AKP tried to dismantle it. That's one theory in Turkish history. But the problem is, if you have no access to the actual intelligence archives or to the military archives, how are you going to prove these theories? You won't be. So they stay in the realm of speculation.
We're approaching 7 o'clock, and we have made a professor who will work very hard. So I think unless there are urgent questions, we might conclude at this point. But not without... Oh, please.
Just
Last question.
Final question, since we're here. Feels it would be wrong not to bring this up. This genocide has been consistently denied across the 20th century. Other genocides that happened in the 20th century, some have been, I guess, there's been some reconciliation, like Rwanda. I'm not an expert, so forgive me if I'm getting things wrong. But the genocide currently happening in Palestine is completely well documented, well recorded, even by some of the perpetrators themselves. Do you have any idea how a society will cope with a genocide which is so obvious, when there can be no real efforts to deny that it took place? You can minimize and you can, but there's no way of just saying it didn't happen. What would the effect, what does that look like compared to a denialist situation?
Yeah, that's very interesting, I think. So we're living in the age of these things, like smartphones, right? So they all have a camera, and there are digital cameras left and right, and GoPros. So, almost in every conflict zone, including in a situation where there's a very serious asymmetric conflict, a genocidal situation, or asymmetric warfare, any and all act of violence is documented. The best example of this argument is the conflict in Syria, of course. Right, so the conflict was 14 years. I know there's an NGO called the Syrian Archive. What they've done since 2011 is consistently download and collect any and all videos of anything related to conflict in Syria. And the guy who runs it is a young man. He once said, and this is when I spoke to him. This would be right before Corona, so 2019. So there was 8 years of conflict. He said, if you take all the videos made in Syria and you put them back to back, it's 30 times longer than the duration of the conflict. So imagine how there's no way of doing research into all of this, of course. Now the question is, having this incredibly obvious evidence out there, can it be denied? I would argue actually that the Armenian genocide also is exceptionally obvious. There's, it's not particularly for the fact that the genocide is deniable, but it's for the reason that the state that denies it is powerful, and was powerful for a long time to deny it. So in this particular case, whether it was the Assad regime, whether it is Israel, as long as they have the will and the means to deny even obvious crimes in front of your eyes, they will do it, right? So they will say, well, there's an airplane that drops a bomb. The Assad regime once said that. A helicopter drops a barrel bomb in a neighborhood. They will say, well, it was the rebels themselves who did it. The rebels don't have helicopters. There's a chemical weapons attack, or a napalm attack on South Lebanon, for example. They will say, yeah, well, Hamas who did it. But they don't have chemical weapons. So it's not about the nature of the conflict is deniable. It's the state that is, or the perpetrating state that is adamant in denying it. And so that means that actually that the bar of evidence is exceptionally high now, right? So you really have to make a very clear, convincing case to make it beyond any reasonable doubt if you want to overcome denial. But I once had a long time ago, I had a really enlightening conversation with Richard Hovhannisyan, to end with that. And he was driving, we were all very old, but still driving a car in Los Angeles, and I was sitting next to him, and I asked him, is there anything that you ever regret in your career? And he said, yes, I regret wasting so much time fighting against Turkish denial. And I asked him why. He said, because we could have used the energy better for actual research. And I thought that was interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Very much.
Thank you.